This press conference revealed something far more dangerous. On live television, Donald Trump spoke to the press in Washington, then abruptly left town. That alone wouldn't matter, except for the contradiction at the center of it. He didn't leave after answers. He left while the questions were getting sharper. And what he said right before walking away created a paradox that still hasn't been resolved. Fact. Just before departing D.C. for a 4-day stay at Mar-a-Lago, Trump posted, quote, "I greatly respect the fact that all scheduled hangings, over 800 of them, have been canceled by the leadership of Iran. Thank you." Those words landed as cameras were rolling and reporters were lining up follow-ups. Inference: this wasn't praise in a vacuum. It collided head-on with Trump's earlier statements when he warned Iran of force if protesters were harmed. Threats then, gratitude now, same situation, same country, completely different posture. Now pause on why this matters to you. When leaders reverse themselves in public, the signal isn't just about foreign policy, it's about credibility. It's about whether statements are leverage or noise. And it's about what happens when accountability depends on whether someone sticks around to face the consequences of their own words. But here's the part nobody is saying out loud. Iran wasn't the only issue unraveling in that room. As Trump prepared to leave Washington, questions stacked up faster than answers. Domestic protests, military force, international alliances, even personal claims that would normally stop a press conference cold. And instead of clarity, the response kept collapsing into the same phrase. Fact, over and over when pressed, Trump said, "We're going to see." Notice what that does. It delays decisions, it blurs responsibility, and it buys time, especially when the next stop is a private resort far from the podium. And then, just as the moment peaked, something stranger entered the picture, something that shifted the story from confusion to something much more revealing. This wasn't one comment, it was a pattern unfolding in real time. Fact. As the press conference continued, reporters didn't stay on Iran. They pivoted quickly. Minnesota protests, federal force, NATO, Greenland, healthcare. Each question came from a different direction, but they all hit the same nerve: decision-making. And each time, the answer circled back to uncertainty. Fact. When asked about Minnesota, Trump posted that the troublemakers, agitators, and insurrectionists are in many cases highly paid professionals, adding that when he is forced to act, it will be solved quickly and effectively. Those words were issued as federal agents were already being discussed on the ground. Inference: the framing matters. Forced to act shifts responsibility away from the person giving the order and onto the situation itself. It suggests inevitability, not choice. Now zoom out. This press conference wasn't about one crisis, it was about how many could be kept unresolved at once. Foreign executions, domestic unrest, military alliances, territorial ambitions, healthcare promises, all moving simultaneously, all partially addressed, none fully owned. But here's where the framing changes. Ask yourself this. What does it signal when a leader answers the most serious questions with delay language? Fact. On Iran, on NATO, on Greenland, the response repeated, "We're going to see." On whether allies influenced his decisions. Nobody convinced me, I convinced myself. On whether actions would follow words. Again, we'll see. Notice what's missing. There's no timeline, no condition, no threshold, just motion without direction. Inference: this isn't randomness. It's a governing style built on ambiguity. Keep options open. Keep consequences undefined. Keep attention moving before it can settle. And just when that ambiguity should have triggered the toughest scrutiny, the press conference took an unexpected turn. Away from policy and straight into something personal, something symbolic, something that reframed the entire event. The moment that changed the temperature in the room came quietly. Fact. A reporter asked Trump why he accepted someone else's Nobel Peace Prize medal. The name was specific. Maria Corina Machado. The question was direct. What do you intend to do with it? And why would you want an award that wasn't given to you? Fact. Trump didn't deny it. He embraced it. On camera, he said, "She offered it to me," adding that she told him, quote, "You've ended 8 wars and nobody deserves this prize more than you." He called it a very nice gesture and repeated that she was a fine woman. Pause there. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a slip of the tongue. This was a public claim of ownership over a symbol that carries global weight. Inference. Symbols matter because they shortcut legitimacy. You don't have to argue outcomes if you can claim recognition. You don't have to prove results if you can point to a medal. Now notice what didn't happen next. There was no clarification, no correction, no distancing. The claim stood on its own, on camera, unchallenged in the moment. Fact, Trump went further. He repeated that he had been very impressed, that he had a lot of respect for her, and that she had respect, obviously, for me and our country. The language wasn't defensive, it was affirming. But here's the part that changes how you see it. This wasn't about a prize. It was about authority, about who gets to declare achievement and who gets to accept it as real. And as the room tried to process that claim, the questions snapped back to something even heavier. Because if words can redefine honors, can they also redefine promises? That's when Iran came back into the frame and the contradiction tightened. The contradiction didn't stay abstract. It snapped back into focus the moment Iran was mentioned again. Fact. A reporter reminded Trump of his earlier statements when he urged Iranian protesters to keep fighting and suggested help was coming. The question was simple. Now that thousands had reportedly been killed, was that help still on the way? Fact, Trump's answer was not escalation, it was restraint. And he said, quote, we're going to see, then returned to the same point he had praised earlier, that Iran had canceled the hanging of over 800 people. He repeated that he greatly respects that decision. This is where the story intensifies. Earlier, the posture was force. Now, the emphasis was gratitude. Same regime, same protests, completely different framing. Inference. This isn't just a shift in tone, it normalizes a new baseline. Instead of measuring action against promises, the standard quietly drops to relief that things didn't get even worse. Notice what that does psychologically. It reframes mass violence as background noise, while restraint becomes the headline. The question moves from what will you do to aren't you glad this stopped? Fact, when asked why he didn't strike Iran, Trump rejected outside influence. Nobody convinced me, I convinced myself, he said, again pointing to the canceled hangings as having a big impact. Here's why that detail changes everything. Decisions of war and peace were being publicly justified not by outcomes, not by strategy, but by a single reversed action, an execution list paused, not erased. This is how normalization works. Expectations slide, accountability blurs, and the scale of what's acceptable quietly shifts downward. And just as that logic settled in, the press conference pivoted again, this time toward America's alliances and a question that would have sounded unthinkable not long ago. The next question landed harder than it should have. Fact, a reporter asked Trump whether he would pull the United States out of NATO if the alliance didn't help him acquire Greenland. Not hypothetically, not someday, directly. Fact, Trump didn't reject the premise. He didn't laugh it off. He said, we're going to see, then added that the U.S. needs Greenland for national security very badly. On camera, he described it as a requirement, not an aspiration. Let that sit for a moment. NATO isn't a talking point. It's a decades-old security structure built on mutual defense. And here it was being discussed as leverage in a territorial negotiation. Inference. This is escalation through normalization. When ideas are repeated calmly, they stop sounding extreme. Withdrawal from NATO becomes just another bargaining chip. Acquisition of foreign territory becomes a deal, not a rupture. Notice the pattern. We'll see. Again, no red lines, no boundaries, just conditional loyalty. If this, then that. Fact. Trump tied Greenland to military investment, missile defense, and national security gaps, saying without it, there would be a big hole. He framed it as necessity, not ambition. Here's why that matters. Once something is labeled necessary, opposition sounds reckless. Debate becomes delay. And urgency becomes justification. But here's the part most people missed in the moment. This wasn't just Trump talking. Others immediately began echoing it. Fact, his trade representative confirmed that tariffs could be used against countries that don't support U.S. goals on Greenland, describing tariffs as a geopolitical tool, not just an economic one. Watch how fast that escalates. Words become policy signals. Signals become pressure. Pressure becomes precedent. And as this idea spread beyond the podium, the question stopped being, would he do this? And became something far more unsettling. What happens if this continues? At this point, the story stopped being theoretical because while alliances and territories sound distant, the consequences don't stay there. They travel downward. They land on people who never get a microphone. Fact. In the same stretch of time, Trump announced what he called a great healthcare plan. He said money would be paid directly to people, not insurance companies. On camera, he described a $2,000 check that Americans would use to buy their own healthcare. That sounds simple, almost generous, and that's the trap. Inference. A flat check shifts risk away from systems and onto individuals. It turns healthcare from a shared structure into a solo negotiation where each person is left to bargain with hospitals and pharmaceutical companies on their own. Now put yourself there. You're sick. You need surgery. The cost is tens of thousands. The leverage you have is a $2,000 check. That's not choice. That's exposure. Fact, when asked how this plan would reduce premiums, Trump called it tremendous, claimed drug prices would drop through most favored nation pricing, and said other countries had no choice but to agree. Notice what's missing again. No mechanism, no enforcement detail, no explanation of what happens when prices don't fall fast enough or when coverage runs out before treatment does. Here's why this matters to you. When policy is vague, consequences aren't. Bills arrive on time, emergencies don't wait for clarity, and the cost of uncertainty is always paid by the person with the least leverage. But here's the deeper connection. Healthcare wasn't an isolated promise. It followed the same pattern as everything else that day. Big claim, minimal detail, responsibility deferred, foreign policy, military alliances, territorial ambition, healthcare, different subjects, same structure. And as those structures stacked up, the press conference revealed something more unsettling than chaos. It revealed a system where uncertainty isn't a flaw, it's a feature. Once you see the pattern, it's impossible to unsee it. Fact. While Trump was making these statements, his trade representative confirmed on camera that tariffs could be imposed on countries that don't support U.S. objectives on Greenland. Not sanctions, tariffs, framed as a routine geopolitical tool. Fact, the explanation was calm. This wasn't pitched as extraordinary. It was described as part of a long line of tradition of using economic pressure to achieve political goals. This is where the mechanism becomes visible. Inference. Tariffs aren't just economic levers here. They're signaling devices. They warn allies and adversaries alike that cooperation is no longer based on shared rules, but on transactional alignment. Now notice how fast that logic spreads. Another official tasked with Greenland echoed the same idea. He spoke about deal-making, about acquiring, about attention being gained because others fear the U.S. might just take it. The language wasn't defensive, it was promotional. This is the system at work. Say something extreme, repeat it calmly, let others restate it, and suddenly what once sounded unthinkable starts to feel procedural. But here's the part that should slow you down. None of this required a formal decision. No vote, no declaration, no signed order, just words layered carefully, moving the baseline inch by inch. Fact, even public opposition was acknowledged. Polling was referenced showing most Americans opposed these ideas. But instead of retreat, the response was reinterpretation. Maybe people just don't understand the strategic benefits. Inference. When disagreement is reframed as ignorance, consent becomes optional. This is how power shifts without an announcement, not through one dramatic act, but through a sequence of normalized statements that rewire expectations. And if that sounds abstract, here's the grounding truth. Systems that rely on ambiguity don't collapse all at once. They stretch, they bend, and they test how much uncertainty people will tolerate before pushing back. So the real question isn't whether any single promise will happen, it's how many unanswered ones can coexist before something finally breaks. At this stage, the story isn't about what already happened, it's about what's forming next. Fact. By the end of the press conference, nothing had been resolved. Iran remained unanswered. NATO remained conditional. Greenland remained on the table. Healthcare remained undefined. Even the meaning of public recognition had been blurred. That uncertainty opens two paths forward. Inference, one path is acceleration. The language hardens. We'll see turns into action without warning. Tariffs become tools of compliance. Alliances become transactional. Ambiguity becomes cover for moves that would have triggered backlash if announced all at once. The other path is friction. Institutions push back. Courts, allies, markets, and public opinion start to resist. Not dramatically, quietly. Deals stall. Cooperation slows. Pressure builds behind the scenes instead of exploding in public. Here's the unsettling part. Both paths can exist at the same time. Fact. Even as questions mounted, Trump left Washington for Mar-a-Lago. The visual mattered. The center of gravity shifted away from the press room, away from immediate scrutiny, toward a space where statements don't have to be clarified in real time. Inference. When decisions move farther from accountability, momentum doesn't disappear, it concentrates. This is why moments like this press conference matter more than they seem. They're not endpoints. They're signals. They tell you what kind of uncertainty is being tolerated and what kind is being prepared. And right now, the signals are mixed on purpose, because if everything stays unresolved, nothing can be fully challenged. And if nothing is fully challenged, the next move doesn't need permission. It just needs timing. Here's the lasting insight from all of this. This wasn't a meltdown. It wasn't chaos. It was something more deliberate. Fact. Across this press conference, Trump didn't collapse under pressure. He avoided resolution. He replaced answers with delay. He substituted clarity with symbols. And when the stakes rose, he physically removed himself from the room. Inference. Power doesn't always announce itself through force. Sometimes it shows up as control over uncertainty, over timing, over when explanations are owed and when they aren't. Reframe the entire story in one sentence. This was a demonstration of how much instability can be normalized before anyone stops it. Not through one decision, but through many non-decisions. Not through one shocking act, but through repetition. We'll see. We're talking. Nobody convinced me. Each phrase lowers the pressure just enough to move on, and that's the loop you should be watching. Not whether a tariff happens, not whether a deal closes, not whether a threat is carried out, but whether ambiguity itself becomes the governing tool. Because once that happens, the most important moments won't look dramatic at all. They'll look like this: calm, unfinished, and already moving on. If you want to understand what comes next before it's obvious, that's what this channel is for. Follow, subscribe, and stay with the analysis. The next move is already taking shape.